Я прошу приветствовать Алексей Досовицкий.
Спасибо за представление. Любезная. Только одна поправка. У меня PhD из смехмата МГУ. Я был постдоком. И да, очень приятно здесь выступать. Приятно, что столько людей интересуются в Москве, в России искусственным интеллектом. Интересно.
Слайдов пока не видно.
Потому что я их шарю.
Так. Леня. Сейчас. У нас просто сегодня столько техник, в 2 раза больше техники из-за трансляции. У нас не один компьютер, там А3 стоит. И, в общем, какая-то хитрая структура, и там экранов столько, что я уже запутался сам. Так, ну что, у нас есть, у нас там есть на том компьютере слайды от Алексея? Алексей, а вы демонстрируете экран, да?
Я демонстрирую экран, я могу его переключить.
Да, мне кажется, что надо его переключить, да, потому что, по-моему, мы по-другому бы его видели.
Большая техническая заминка. Про уголок, который я знаю, больше про другие вещи, в котором я сам немного работал, но много замечательных тем, такие как генерация изображений и другого контента, 3D, геометрия, optical flow, обработка видео и так далее. Про них я ничего или почти ничего не скажу. Это не значит, что они неинтересны, просто за 45 минут можно рассказать только про ограниченное число вещей. И в связи с этим, кроме того, будет очень много статей, потому что даже в этом уголке очень много всего происходит. Поэтому, ну, во-первых, я про каждый буду говорить очень кратко, во-вторых, слайды, возможно, не всегда будут идеально полированы, и в-третьих, я думаю, что получится расшарить слайды после выступления, и тогда все смогут посмотреть подробности в самих статьях. Так, вот, теперь, собственно, начинаем. Vision in 2020, Transformers, Transfer and Beyond is the topic, so I'll start with a bit of background on how all these topics came about, very briefly, and then talk about a few areas in order. First about image classification and transfer, and then different beyond parts, beyond supervised training, so unsupervised, self-supervised, semi-supervised, and such. Then beyond classification, which means other tasks such as detection, imitation, etc. Then beyond images, which means not doing things just with images, but also with other modalities, such as 3D or video or text or such. And finally, in the end, if we have time left, a few other bits and pieces, a few other interesting papers that didn't fit into any of these, but I still thought are exciting to share. Okay, so the first piece of background is about transformers and BERT. Hopefully by now you know what they are, and if you don't, probably in the NLP section, which, as I understand it, after this one, they will be mentioned a lot. But very, very briefly, transformer is a set processing model that takes a set of tokens and then it applies a sequence of self-attention layers and multi-layer perceptrons to the sequence of tokens. And yeah, this way it processes this sequence. Multi-layer perceptrons are basically just per token processing, while self-attention is a global aggregation where each token attends to all other tokens. And this way, by by doing these two steps in turn, you build a transformer, and it turns out it works really well for many language tasks. And a great property it has is that it's very efficient to implement on accelerators like GPUs or TPUs, which makes it possible to train large models on large data sets. So it's efficient and scalable. And one very prominent use case was BERT, which is a transformer pre-trained on the self-supervised task of gap filling in text. So you take text, you mask out some of the words, and you train the model to fill them back in. And it turns out that this works really well. So if you pre-train the model this way, it learns something about text, and then you can fine-tune it on other language tasks, and it works really well. Which was kind of the start of this revolution in NLP, which is now still ongoing, where the self-supervised pre-training is the thing to do. And I'm also sorry in advance, I'm not an expert in NLP. Let the others in the NLP section later correct me if they disagree. Right, so this was in 2017-2018, and now more recently, this has been developing. One example is the T5, text-to-text transfer transformer. The idea there is to formulate many different language tasks as text-to-text translation, and then pre-train a large transformer. I think they had like 11 billion parameters or something, which is quite large. Train it BERT style and show that it transfers really well. So basically, in a nutshell, BERT, but made really large and applied to many tasks, and they show that it works really, really well. And another very well-known example is GPT-3, generative pre-training from OpenAI. Again, the general idea is very similar, but they do generative pre-training, which means they don't do this BERT masking thing, but they model text, so they train the model to predict next token from the previous chunk of tokens, and they have an even larger model. The biggest one is 175 billion parameters, and turns out that this learns a lot about text and can do many tasks zero shot. So you just trained it to predict internet text, but then you can ask it many different questions, like including, I don't know, arithmetic and question answering and so on, and it can just do them, which is really impressive. So one might argue that large-scale self-supervised pre-training to some degree solved NLP. I wouldn't claim that it's really solved, but it's really a huge progress and very impressive. And I guess we in Vision have been looking at this and kind of being envious and thinking of whether we could pull off something like this. And what I'm going to talk about next is kind of largely or partially inspired by this successes in language. Okay, so now to Vision. First bit about classification and transfer. And the first paper I'll talk about is called Big Transfer Bit. The idea here is to try to push the pre-training and then fine-tuning paradigm more or less to the limit. So this idea has been around for a long time. You pre-train on ImageNet and then you fine-tune on your task of interest, and the pre-trained model allows you get better performance on your target task with less data. But then this was like ImageNet came about like 10 years ago. So can we do better than that? Can we scale things? Can we take larger models, larger data sets and do the same thing? And it turns out we can, and it works really well. Here are a few different data sets. The leftmost one is ImageNet, and then a few others, CIFAR 10-100, Bets Flowers. Then different colors are different types of models. So blue is this bit, which is exactly this large ResNet on large data set. You pre-train it on a really large JFT data set, and then you fine-tune it on these data sets listed here. and the other yellow and green are previous state-of-the-art. And in the plots, the x-axis is the number of training samples, and the y-axis is accuracy. So being high and on the left is good. And you can see that the blue curves here are really quite high up. So, and especially compared to green curves, which are ImageNet pre-training. So it turns out if you take a big model and pre-train it on a big data set, then let's say on ImageNet, just with 5 samples per class, you can get more than 70% accuracy. And like on CIFAR 10, almost 95, etc. So this is really, really exciting that just by kind of a relatively boring approach of pre-training a large model on a large data set, you get really, really good transfer results, including in few-shot regime, so with very little training data. This is a bit of a deeper dive into the scaling question. The x-axis are different data sets, the y-axis is the transfer performance averaged over many tasks, and then the different circles are models of different size, pre-trained on these different data sets. And what one can observe is that it's really important to combine large models with large data sets to get best results, because here in the bottom, you see that the small blue circle, ResNet 50, it kind of gets limited improvement from increasing the data set size, while the bigger models, the bigger circles, they keep improving with larger data set sizes. So this tells us that models and data sets should be scaled together. And then another interesting point about these large models is that they also robust. So one well-known issue with machine learning models is that they don't generalize very well to out of distribution data. So maybe they work for the kind of data you trained them on, but then when you try to apply them to something else, they fail horribly. And there are some special benchmarks for this. I think this particular plot is on ObjectNet, which is basically a specifically collected data set of kind of non-standard views of objects on which ImageNet trained models usually struggle. And the three lines of different colors are models pre-trained on different data sets. On the orange one is on ImageNet, the green one is on ImageNet 21K, which is a larger version of ImageNet, and the blue is on GFT, which is a large Google data set of images. And it's really nice to see that training large models on large data sets also is very good in terms of robustness. So it's really a huge improvement, and kind of suggests that perhaps this way one can get properly robust models. Okay, so that was all with ResNets, just large ResNets and large data sets. And now, can we do better than ResNets architecture-wise is something many people have been thinking, partially inspired by how transformers replaced LSTMs, or almost replaced LSTMs in language. And so what would be the kind of counterpart in vision for this move to transformers? And I mean, one could just try transformer for vision, but the problem is that self-attention is quadratic in the sequence length. So because it has this, each token attends to each other token, this is quadratic in the number of tokens. So if you just treat the image as a sequence of pixels, then it will be a very long sequence. And because of this quadratic computation, it gets really, really expensive. So you cannot just apply transformer to images. And that's why, yeah, the question becomes how to deal with this, and people have proposed different solutions. So one is local self-attention. It's been around for some time now, but there are still more and more papers coming out on this. Here's a kind of cartoon of convolution and local self-attention. In convolution, you just have this block of learned weights, and you apply it as a sliding window to the input features. While in local self-attention, you also have like some local thing which you apply in a sliding window fashion, but this local thing is now a small self-attention layer. So now it's not just multiplying the input with the weights, but it's doing all these things with keys and values and softmax and so on. And I won't dive into details because it takes a while to properly understand how this works. So if you know, then you know. If you don't know, then and you're interested, then look it up offline. But basically, the idea is that instead of usual multiplication, as you do in convolution, you do this little local self-attention. And then because it's like a similar type of thing as convolution, also a local operation, you can basically just take any convnet and replace any convolutional layers you like by this local self-attention. And people have done it in multiple works. I think most, like one recent one from this year is this Zhao et al., which does some slightly more fancy version of self-attention, vector self-attention. And basically people have shown that doing this helps. So these models usually beat ResNets a bit. However, the downside is that these local self-attention operation is tricky to implement efficiently, so it's not very easy to make it scale on accelerators. Okay, then another idea is axial self-attention. So here you don't attend to all the input at once, but you attend either just to the column or just to the row of the input. So because the images have this 2D structure, you can basically decompose the full attention to the full input into these two sub-steps. So let's say vertical attention first and then horizontal next. And this can be seen as kind of factorized. These two taken together can be seen as a factorized version of full self-attention. Of course, it's not strictly as powerful, but it also gives each token a global field of view, which is different from local self-attention, because in local, the receptive fields, the fields of view of tokens are very limited, but here, after these two steps, you already get global field of view, so every token talks to every token in a way. And yeah, it turns out you can also make these layers. Now they are linear in the input size because you just always attend along one dimension, and that's much more efficient, and you can basically replace some convolutions in the usual convnet by these layers, and that's what this Axial DeepLab or Axial ResNet paper does, and it works quite well. It also brings some improvements on classification, but also even more so on panoptic segmentation, which I'll talk about a bit later. And yet another thing you can do, which is somewhat near and dear to my heart because I participated in it actively, is you can basically apply a transformer directly to image, but to deal with this quadratic complexity, you don't apply it to pixels, but you apply it to patches. So you take the image, you cut it into patches, let's say of 16 by 16 pixels each, and then you treat these patches as a sequence of tokens. So basically you linearly project each of them to a vector. You add position embeddings, which is what it's the standard thing in transformers, to let the model know where each token is located, and then can feed the sequence through the very usual transformer encoder. And in our case, we trained it on classification, so we will have a small MLP head on top and predict logits, and then the whole thing can be trained on image classification in supervised fashion end to end. And this is more similar to a standard transformer than the previous things I talked about. So essentially, it is a standard transformer, except that it's not applied directly to raw pixels, but to these patches. And another version we tried is hybrid. So the top row here is what I just talked about. So take an image, extract patches, and then apply transformer to that. Hybrid is take an image, apply a contnet or ResNet, let's say, and then take the feature vectors from that one and treat them as tokens and apply a transformer on top. So it's basically trying to combine the best of both worlds, both a ResNet and a transformer. So here is one interesting point. It's a similar plot to what I've shown for ResNets in bit, but now it's for transformers here. Again, the x-axis is our different data sets, and the y-axis is transfer accuracy when we pre-train this transformer on GFT and then on different data sets and then transfer to ImageNet. And the gray area are the different ResNets from bit. So what one can see here is that on small data, or well, on relatively small data set, not so large data set on ImageNet, the colorful circles are quite down below. So that means that without super heavy regularization, they don't work very well on relatively small data sets, but then on larger data sets, the transformers, the colorful circles get much better, and then on the largest one, for instance, on GFT, they're quite a bit better than best ResNets. So the conclusion here is that transformers especially shine with a lot of data, and with little data, without heavy regularization, they are tricky to make work. However, people in the meantime have shown that with heavy regularization, it can work well also on ImageNet from scratch. It's in this paper linked below. Also, they rebranded it for some reason, which is kind of not so nice, but the basic result that it can be trained with heavy regularization is quite interesting. And then the main thing we have been interested in when working on this vision transformer was how well it scales to large models. And that can be analyzed with this kind of plots, where the x-axis is the amount of compute taken by pre-training in some units, exaflops, and the y-axis is some transfer accuracy. So basically, obviously more expensive models transfer better generally, but the question is how at, let's say, the given budget we can get the best accuracy. So like we want to push this frontier to the top left in this plot. And here is a comparison of ResNets, transformers, and hybrids. And basically one observation is that transformers are better than ResNets. The frontier of transformers of these blue circles is higher than gray squares. And second observation is that hybrids are pretty good in the low data, or not low data, but small model, small-ish, smaller, not so huge model regime on the left-hand side. So the orange crosses are above the blue circles here on the left, but then on the right, for really large models, somehow this advantage vanishes. One interpretation could be that if the model is large enough, then architecture matters much less, because any model can learn to do anything if it's large enough, and so like these differences between architectures maybe stop mattering very much. It could also be that we simply didn't tune it well enough, so that remains to be seen. But yeah, basically transformers are better than ResNets in terms of scaling. And then also, yeah, the biggest models work really well on different benchmarks. So yeah, the first two columns are different vision transformers, and then the third column is bit, else it's the biggest ResNet from this big transfer project I talked about before, and then the last column is prior state of the art. Yeah, basically you can see all those bold numbers in the left, which mean that these big models work really well. And also, if you think about the numbers, are quite impressive, like 95% of CFR100 or 88.5 on ImageNet. Top one is really, really good. And also the last row shows the pre-training compute, and it's good to see that these transformers are also cheaper to pre-train than big ResNets. So that's great. transformers work pretty well. Oh, I also must note that in the meantime, on some, at least on ImageNet, the state of the art is already different. So like in the meantime, this number is beaten, but I'll talk about it a bit later, actually. Okay. Yeah. So I'll probably won't get to the end of the slides, but I'll try. So now this was it about supervised training and transfer. Now, what else can we do other than supervised training? One very popular idea recently is contrastive learning. It hasn't come up last year, but it has been actively developed last year. And this SimClear is one representative example of a contrastive learning method. And basic idea here is very simple. You take an unlabeled set of images, you augment each image, and then so like by transformations such as the ones here on the bottom left in this so like crop, precise, geometric transformations, also color, masking, and so on. And then you train a model in such a way that it embeds the different transformed versions of each image close together, but it embeds different images far away from each other. So all these different transformed things should stay close in the representation space, while different images should not be too close. And then, yeah, so that's basically what's depicted here on the right. And there is a bunch of tricks. So the idea of doing this, something like this, has been around for a long time, but recently just people figured out a bag of tricks that actually helps to make it work really well, such as having like this additional little G prediction head on top and taking the representation from down below. I won't dive into details, but the result is that now this method works really pretty well. So if you train the SimClear on ImageNet without any labels, and then you freeze the representation and train a linear classifier on top of this representation, then you get really pretty good. These red stars are the SimClear results. The here on the left, top left, is supervised, which is kind of an upper bound. If you train a model on the full dataset supervised, that's what you get. And this contrastive pre-training gets really quite close. So it's 70-ish% versus 76. And then if you take a bigger model, so the x-axis is model size. If you take bigger models, then you can actually even reach or slightly beat the fully supervised small model. So yeah, it turns out with all these tricks, you can get really, really quite far. And then I'll talk briefly about a couple more ideas in this space. One problem with SimClear is that in practice they require really large batch sizes, because turns out for this contrastive approach to work, you need many negatives. So these negatives, which are like different images, should be different. Turns out that there should be many enough of them, because otherwise things don't optimize well. And for these really large batch sizes, you normally need also really large computers, like a lot of chips, a lot of GPUs or TPUs, which is not practical for many people. And then MoCo is a way that allows to not require these huge hardware resources. Basically, they use small batches, as illustrated here on the right. They use small batches, but they also maintain a queue of negatives. So basically, they remember the negatives from the previous steps and put them all in a big queue and always contrast against this queue. And to make this work, turns out to make sure that these sampled in the queue don't get too stale, they have this momentum encoder, which is a slowly changing version of the encoder, kind of a sliding average of the recent encoder weights. And this way, it turns out you can make this whole queue idea work, and then you can only train on small batches, but have this large queue of negatives. And that also works pretty well. And another interesting development was this bootstrap your own latent by all, which can be seen as kind of similar to this MoCo that I just talked about. It also has a kind of online network that's being trained, and it also has this slow changing kind of sliding average network. And what they do is they predict the representation of this target network by the online network. And turns out that they don't even need negatives anymore. So don't need the whole contrastive learning idea. It turns out just with these two networks, you can do simple prediction without any contrasting, and it works and doesn't collapse. So normally the problem can be that this online network and target would just collapse to something trivial, and then this prediction task would be really simple because, you know, if both of them are constant, it's easy to predict. But it turns out that with some tricks you can avoid such collapse, and then it works really, really well. Here on the right is the same plot, the same type of plot as I showed before, but now like it's a bit later, and you see SimClear that looked really good on that plot is here on the bottom left. And then there's a bunch of new methods, including this by all, which is really now very, very close to the supervised baseline upper bound. Right, and let me skip SimClear v2 in the interest of time. But it turns out that if you do semi-supervised learning, which means you use a lot of unlabeled data and some labeled data at the training time, then you can get really, really good results. With semi-supervised learning, you can get really, really close to fully supervised, even with very few labels, such as 1%, for instance. Here, this, again, I'm not diving into details of what exactly is going on, but this gray dashed line is the fully supervised model with all labels. And then here the models are trained with 1 or 10% of labels, and turns out that with 1% labels, you can get really, really, really close to fully supervised. And if you use a larger model, then you can match the fully supervised. And finally, yet another idea in this field is pseudo-labeling. It's, again, a bit related, but also a bit different. The idea here is to train a small model on a labeled data set, let's say on ImageNet, and then you use this teacher model to label a large unlabeled data set. So you kind of make predictions with this teacher model on a large data set for which you don't have labels, and this way you get the pseudo labels from the teacher. And then you train a large student model with a lot of regularization to predict the pseudo labels. And turns out this works really well. It's kind of a bit counterintuitive because you somehow magically make up these pseudo labels and train a model on them, but turns out this works really, really well. This really helps compared to just supervised training on the small-ish data set. And yeah, basically, again, from many bold numbers here, you can see that this really helps a lot on ImageNet, also on different robustness evaluations around ImageNet. And recently, this meta pseudo labels, which is an extension of this idea, got to like over 90% on ImageNet, which is quite crazy if you think about it. Yeah, so interestingly enough, with this trick, you can use unlabeled data almost as efficiently as if it would be labeled data, which is really impressive. On the topic of ImageNet, I also linked here. I won't talk about it, but it's a nice paper, Are We Done with ImageNet, which talks about whether pushing ImageNet further even makes sense, and whether there's really high numbers of ImageNet mean anything. And I mean, the conclusion is that it kind of makes some sense, but the labels are not ideal, and they propose a way to fix them. So take a look if you're interested. All right, and last but not least, OpenAI also had this quite different approach. It's not contrastive at all anymore. It's basically taking GPT, generative pre-training, and applying it to images, which is you take an image, you interpret it as a sequence of pixels, and then you either do BERT on the sequence of pixels, so basically this masking loss, or you do autoregressive prediction, which means you predict the next pixel from the previous pixels in the sequence. As I said, the problem is that images are large, so they can only do it at low resolution or with some tricks. But turns out, still, if you do this well, and if you train a big transformer to do this, you get really pretty good transfer results. Here are CFAR and ImageNet, and the numbers are on ImageNet especially are quite a bit worse than what I've shown with contrastive methods in the previous slides, but they are kind of in the ballpark. They are, an ImageNet approach is 70% on CFAR 10, for instance. It's really, really good. And this is actually very surprising. So no one thought, well, at least I didn't think, most people didn't think that this generative type of training can work on images. But apparently, if you just make everything really big, then it can work. And also generates very pretty pictures. I'm not showing them here, but if you follow the links to the blog posts, you can see very cool pictures. And also DALL-E is the more recent iteration of a similar idea, and that has like really, really cool pictures. So I would recommend everyone to have a look. Okay. Yeah, I wonder, do I have to stop at 55 sharp or? Silence. Okay, I'll keep going for some more time. Okay, so this was all classification, and now a couple of words about some other tasks. One prominent method was detection transformer. Here you, as is obvious from the name, you apply a transformer to detection. So basically there is a image, you embed it with ConvNet, get some feature maps, and then on top of the feature maps, you train a transformer encoder decoder to directly generate a set of box predictions. And then this set of box predictions you can match to the ground truth set of boxes with some matching algorithm, and then you can train the model to directly output the correct set of boxes. This is very different from how detection is traditionally done, and kind of very direct. You just output the set of boxes, and turns out it works pretty well. Beats a well-tuned, faster RCNN, which is a very standard detection model. Also works well on panoptic segmentation, which I don't show here. So it's really impressive work. It's a pity I have to run so fast here, but it's really, really impressive. And what's perhaps even more impressive is that recently there has been some progress on top of this paper. For instance, deformable data is the same model with some additional tricks, like instead of usual attention, they do some deformable attention, and that makes it even much better. So it trains faster, and they improve it by like 7% mean average precision compared to Detter, which is like a pretty huge number in just a few months. And now it gets actually really quite competitive with SOTA. Not state of the art yet, but getting there. And given the rate of progress, it's kind of easy to imagine that soon it will be state of the art. This max zplab is basically the same idea, but for panoptic segmentation and done well, and it works really well. So it's again, basically you take an image and predict a set of segmentation masks for all the instances and for all the background classes in the image. That's what panoptic segmentation is. And also trained end-to-end with transformer works really well. A big table with results, which we don't have the time to properly look at, but the bottom row in this table is the best of their models, of max zplab models, and it's really very close or getting state of the art. And one can also do segmentation, which I will skip. To move on beyond images, so people also have applied transformers to, for instance, point clouds. It's a very natural idea because point cloud is a set and transformers operate on sets, so good match. And turns out that if you carefully design a transformer-like model, with local attention and like some hourglass shape, then you can get state of the art or very close on several prominent benchmarks. Another pretty big area, which I'll only touch on briefly here, is multi-modal learning, vision and language. So because transformers came from language and now they are coming to vision, it's also very natural to build transformer-based models that combine both modalities. And there are many papers on this, but this Uniter is one representative one. Here they take an image and take the detected bounding boxes with some detector from this image, and they take the corresponding text. So they would train it on multimodal dataset with images and captions. They take the bounding boxes, take the text, embed it jointly with transformer, and then train it on multiple different self-supervised tasks, such as bird style infilling of image part, or bird style infilling of text based on image, and a few others. And by training it this way, they get great results on a bunch of vision and language tasks. So now it's not just one modality, but also across modalities. And another thing you can do is you can use multimodal data to learn really good visual representations. So in Uniter, they wanted multimodal representations, which can do image and text tasks. Well, here the idea is to get visual representations, and CLIP is one really impressive example of that from OpenAI recently. There were many other papers before, but here they really pushed it to the limit, and it works really well. Basically, again, you take a lot of images with captions and train a model that kind of matches the images with the corresponding text. So basically, given a set of captions and a set of images, the model tries to match them correctly. So tell which ones go together. And if you do it properly on a large data set and with a large model, it works really, really well. So if you train this model on a lot of web data and then you apply it to, let's say, ImageNet, so you basically design your set of captions such that they represent the ImageNet labels, but without any fine-tuning, just zero shot, just by designing the captions you're selecting from in a smart way, you can get like really good performance on ImageNet, zero shot, without seeing any ImageNet data at training time at all, 76%. And also it's very good on different robustness versions of ImageNet as shown here. So on ImageNet itself, it's good, but kind of not amazing, but on different cartoon or sketch or such versions of ImageNet, it's much, much better than usual supervised models from ImageNet. So that's really impressive. It shows that with large web data, one can train really, really good models that generalize very well. And I guess I should now really wrap up, and you can hopefully look at the bits and pieces yourselves when the slides are hopefully shared. To conclude, there is a lot of exciting progress on transformers and transfer and different tasks and multimodal learning, but vision is still not solved. Like, vision is still kind of a bit behind language in being solved, I would argue, and so a lot remains to be done. Thanks.
Огромное спасибо. Алексей, слышно меня?
Да.
Да, отлично, да. Огромное спасибо. У меня такое ощущение, что трансформеры стремительно вторгаются вообще везде уже теперь. Скоро, наверное, нужно будет делать отдельную конференцию только по трансформерам. Не только, они начинали с языка, теперь в видео, а теперь еще, ну, как бы в изображении, а теперь еще и мультимодальные истории. У нас есть вопросы? У нас есть один вопрос в чате, от меня вопрос. В зале есть вопросы? Если есть, то поднимайте руку, к вам подойдут. Алексей, у меня пока к вам вопрос. Меня зацепила, честно, одна фраза, которую вы сказали, рассказывая про трансформеры, про то, что вы видите, что с увеличением моделей как бы она работает все лучше и лучше, и вам даже кажется, что, может быть, архитектура не так становится важна. Все-таки, ну, у меня ощущение, что именно, ну, как бы трансформер как архитектура, как подход, определил как бы успехи вот этого направления, а все-таки размер сети важен, но, ну, то есть, вот вы думаете, что рост размера сети реально, ну, там, имеет решающее значение, или все-таки архитектура имеет решающее значение?
Да, это хороший вопрос. Ну, нет, это я, конечно, не совсем правильно сказал, что архитектура не имеет значения. Конечно, архитектура имеет значение, и если попытаться взять просто multi-layer perceptron, полносвязанную сеть, и ее сделать очень большой, то это не заработает хорошо. Конечно, архитектура имеет значение. Что я имел в виду, это что многие трюки, которые помогают на маленьких моделях, перестают играть роль на больших моделях. То есть уроки относительно архитектур в таком более дешевом режиме совсем не обязательно переносятся на большие модели, и даже иногда бывает наоборот, что они вредят на больших моделях. И часто что-то такое относительно простое, как просто трансформер без всяких прибамбасов, работает хорошо. Но, конечно же, это значит, наверное, что в самом трансформере есть что-то правильное, и, конечно же, не исключено, что можно сделать еще лучше, но мы пока не знаем как, и многочисленные попытки с трудом продвигаются.
Окей, спасибо огромное. У нас есть еще вопрос. Понимают ли современные NLP-модели смысл текста? А если нет, то как добиться такого понимания?
Ну, это хороший вопрос, который, наверное, более уместен для NLP-сессии, но и это вопрос в некотором роде философский. Я бы сказал нет, я бы сказал, они его учат как бы наизусть и воспроизводят, но да, я думаю, что лучше не...
А для визуальных?
И я думаю, что если очень хорошо учить текст наизусть и воспроизводить, то уже в какой-то момент становится сложно отличить это от понимания.
Я согласен. Это больше, это как бы человек, наверное, написал действительно, это больше для NLP-сессии, а для визуального изображения можно сказать, что модель понимает смысл изображения, если она правильно его, например, там классифицирует, распознает?
Ну да, хороший вопрос. Это примерно похожая ситуация. Как бы я думаю, что когда вы тренируете большую модель на больших данных, она просто видит больше примеров и как бы лучше, она больше всего видит, и поэтому как бы лучше генерализируется на другие случаи. И это выглядит, как будто бы она лучше понимает, например, там какой-нибудь... Раньше там полосатый диван модель классифицировала бы как тигр, а теперь она правильно классифицирует ее как диван. Это выглядит, как будто она понимает, хотя, может быть, на самом деле это просто потому, что она больше всего видела, но в какой-то момент становится очень сложно отличить эти вещи.
Окей. Спасибо огромное. В зале у нас... один вопрос. Давайте короткий вопрос. Что же вы так поздно? Я же специально задал вопрос, чтобы успели... Один короткий вопрос, и то, что мы out of timing уже. Не слышно вас. Микрофон у нас включен.
Как раз.
Да.
Спасибо за доклад. И вопрос такой, вот, нашумевшая сейчас модель, вот это клип, да, которая, то есть, одновременно обучение.
Погромче говорите, чтобы
обучение получается, там, картинки с текстом. Вот, и есть подозрение, что она там будет работать, для простых объектов, простых взаимосвязей. А есть какое-то представление, как это будет для более сложных, ситуаций работать? Вот. Такой вот вопрос.
Про Дали, да?
Что вы имеете в виду под простыми и сложными какой-нибудь пример?
Вот, например, ImageNet, да, там одна картинка, там простое текстовое описание, да, если какие-то сложные объекты, которые встречаются редко, да, там, и я хочу, например, на своем датасете кастомном обучить, вот, могу ли я рассчитывать, что вот этот, клип-модель, да, будет нормально работать, zero-shot learning и все такое?
Я вам конкретно про клип не скажу, потому что он еще новый, и у меня с ним не очень много опыта. В принципе, эта тренировка на больших веб-данных должна быть хороша для редких классов, потому что в интернете, в отличие, например, от ImageNet, где фиксированы тысячи классов, в интернете чего только нет, поэтому если тренироваться на веб-данных, модель тоже увидит много всякого, в том числе и редкие вещи, и должна хорошо работать с редкими вещами, поэтому я думаю, что с long-tail классами, с редкими, должно быть неплохо. Другой вопрос, например, вот вы сказали, что ImageNet картинки обычно фокусируются на одном объекте. Вот это менее ясно, и это, я думаю, возможно, ограничение. Эти модели, они обычно хорошо справляются с картинками, где более-менее один объект, но когда, например, какая-нибудь большая сцена, где много всего происходит, там как-то взаимодействует много объектов, вот это у них пока плохо получается, и над этим, по-моему, еще надо работать.
Да, спасибо большое.
Так, огромное спасибо. Алексей, еще раз попрошу поаплодировать.